Hi, everybody. This is Bruce. As you can see, as you can also probably see, I am by myself, which is a valuable lesson for me that I should not schedule a post-retreat meeting on NFL playoff weekend. This there's no one here except me. So what this is turning into instead is I'll give you a quick tutorial and I'll make some announcements. It'll be fairly short. And I'll let you know what the next steps are for moving forward with your writing. Uh, I'll be brief. First, though, before I get into any sort of announcements or any sort of tutorial materials, I want to re-emphasize how much I enjoyed last weekend with each of you. What a wonderful group with such an amazing stories that you have to tell, so much potential. And regardless of whether you continue with me or not, I want to emphasize the importance of continuing your writing, continuing on your author path, because every one of you, with the stories that you described as part of this retreat, has such potential and has such an amazing story to tell. I'm excited to see where you go with this, and I would love to help you along the path. I would be honored and privileged to help you along the path. And I know that many of you are already involved in the one-on-one program. Kevin, Cynthia, Lee, um, and, uh, and Carmen as well. And I'm hoping that more can join us as part of this journey. More of you can join me in helping you as part of this journey. So I'm excited. I've been on a high this last week as I've met with some other friends of mine and talked with different people. And in fact, yesterday, one of my former authors, Bob Hendrickson, who you saw on at the very end of our last Sunday meeting, as part of the retreat, Bob Hendrickson was one of the authors that talked to us. He was actually in San Diego yesterday, and he and I got together and spent the day together. It's the first time I had seen Bob since we were both in the Air Force in the 1980s and had a wonderful time. We had a wonderful time yesterday. We went and saw the USS Midway and had lunch and had dinner and just had a great time getting to know each other beyond the book writing aspect. And the only reason I bring this up is that one of the blessings that I have found for me, one of the blessings that I've been given regarding this entire author coaching and book writing process is that I have connected with so many wonderful authors and including old friends like Bob. And it is just such a joy. And it's what inspires me to go ahead with my workday each day. And I just love it. And all of you are a huge part of this as well. So I want to thank you for coming to the retreat, and thank those of you who want to continue on in the one-on-one coaching program or go to further retreats down the line. I really look forward to that. I thank all of you for being a part of this journey with me, and you should be very proud of yourself, because I know writing for 2 days straight can be draining. It requires a lot of energy, but it also requires a lot of commitment. And you've committed to starting your book, and hopefully and most certainly you can continue down that path to completion, and I can help you with all that. So let me describe a couple of things. First of all, you've heard me mention the one-on-one author program, and just to let you know that that can take a couple of different forms. One form is weekly meetings for an hour, and Cynthia is involved in that. And I will also tell you that both Doug Davidson and Bob Hendrickson have been one-on-one weekly authors, meaning that they would write a chapter roughly each week. Sometimes they'd write two in a week, and I would review them, and we'd go through those chapters on a Zoom meeting, a 1 hour Zoom meeting each week. We typically set it at a specific time, but that's flexible depending on schedules. And it worked out really well. And that's the quickest way you can get done. And Cynthia, I mentioned Cynthia, obviously, several times. She has joined that program, and she's making wonderful progress. And her book is developing amazingly. It's just such an excellent book. It's so well written and so engaging and heartfelt. It's really going to be something outstanding. So that's one way to do it, and that's a great way to do it. Most authors have difficulty meeting a weekly deadline to submit chapters or to do work. It's because of schedule constraints or other work or other commitments that they have. They find it kind of difficult to meet that, and almost becomes a burden. For those authors, the best way, very likely, is to, or if you feel like you're in that situation, the best way to proceed with the one-on-one program is to meet every other week. Be the same time every other week, and it would be for an hour and a half. And what that provides is a little bit more of a break in between meetings, but you can also proceed just as fast as the weekly meetings. The way you would do that is to write a couple chapters each week, and then we would just have our meetings every 2 weeks for an hour and a half. It's longer than the weekly meetings, and we go through both chapters there and through any other chapters that you've reviewed and submitted revisions to me. So it can be both ways. The cost is the same for both of them. It's $200 a month to do that. And what I found, I'll be very honest here, is that unless authors are in one or the other coaching program, one or the other one-on-one coaching programs, it's really easy to just let it slide, to kind of put your writing to the side with all of the good intent of getting to it sometime soon, but you don't get back to it. And it's human nature. It's understandable. This is not a judgment I'm making on anybody. Please don't take it that way. What I'm saying is that it's part of the reason for the success of the one-on-one program is that there's a commitment. There's a commitment from me to help you, but there's also a commitment you make to yourself to continue on this writing journey so that you're able to complete your writing in a relatively quick amount of time. And as an example, for Doug Davidson and Bob Hendrickson, they were both done with their writing within 9 months. I think Bob was even shorter than that. He was like 7 or 8 months. So you can make it pretty quick, and you can go through this pretty quickly, I should say. And it's more than just finishing your book. Of course, that's the goal, is that you want to finish your book, but what you really want is to have a book that you're really proud of, that you can give to family and friends and put on Amazon and use as part of your credibility and all of the things that come with being an author. You want a book that you can be really proud of. And this program, I guarantee you, will help you create a book that you can be really proud of. And that's my promise to you. And that has certainly worked out so far. And it is in the process of working out with Cynthia. I've got another author, Dave Dimmick. Some of you know him from previous retreats. He did this a little bit differently. He went to a lot of the different retreats before he got into the one-on-one program. And he did that specifically so that when he went to retreats, he could devote his time to writing and creating material, and he got a bunch of material created, and then we got into the coaching program, and that worked really well for him. So it was a little bit of a hybrid in the sense that he did a lot of retreat writing, but then got into the coaching program, and he's getting pretty close to being done. So you'll see, for those of you who follow along, if you get his book when it comes out, and we are shooting for a spring 2022 release, maybe early summer, and it's going to be fantastic. And I can tell you more on that later, and I'll be putting posts on my Facebook about his upcoming book when it gets closer to release. So bottom line, if you want to continue to make progress, the best way to do that, and the one that is guaranteed to help you go all the way through to completion, to publishing, to running through the tape, is the one-on-one coaching program. And I would be honored and privileged to help any of you, all of you, with this. So there's my pitch for that, and we can talk about it more. You can email me, or you can give me a call. You got my phone number too. I would love to talk to you more. Specifically for Amber and Kelly and Meg, because you are first-time authors and you paid the first-time author price for the retreat, you get a free one-on-one coaching with me after the retreat. And I'll send you an email about this. And what that entails is you picking a portion of what you wrote at the retreat and sending that to me. And then we can talk about it at a 1-hour meeting within the next couple of weeks. And I'll send you, like I said, I'll send you an email about that, and there will be a link where you can make an appointment with me, and we'll talk further about it. If you have any questions, you can email me too, and I can help clarify any of that. So there's the one-on-one program. So as I mentioned, Dave Dimmick did a lot of his writing just as part of the retreats. At least he did that for a good while, for many months, and then he got into the one-on-one coaching program. So as you may have noticed, especially those of you who have been here to retreats previously, 2/3 of the people that were at this retreat were prior authors, or prior retreat authors. And I'm honored that you would come back and join me at the retreat. And clearly there's value in doing that. Carmen, I know, is part of that group, and thank you, Carmen, for that. And Kevin, brother Kevin, I should mention him. Kevin's part of my one-on-one program too. He does that every other week. So, and Kevin's been at a lot of retreats. He might have the record. I don't know. And it's wonderful. I love having repeat business, and many authors use that as their vehicle for writing material. So what they're doing for many months is every other month. The retreats happen about every other month or so. And so every other month, they make an appointment, they make a commitment to themselves, and they go to retreat, and they do retreat writing over the weekend. And it works really well for them. It gets them moving forward in a really great manner. So yeah, so there's that offer. For returning authors who have been to a previous retreat, the return price is half price. So $98, you get to go to the retreat. There's the prep portion of the retreat, but there's also during the retreat, there's the support, there's I can have individual consultations with any of you that want. So that's available too. And that works out well. And yes, I freely admit that if you were so motivated, you could, since you've already been through the process and you understand the process of doing inspired writing, you could do this without being in a retreat. And if you can do that, that's perfectly fine. I'm not discouraging that at all. What I find is that it's rare. I don't know of anyone actually who has taken the time to do a retreat, to spend 2 days writing and devoting that amount of time without being in a retreat. So, and you can write your book without the one-on-one coaching too. I wrote my book without the one-on-one coaching, but it took me a long time. And I think and authors have done it for years and years. So but I think I'm fairly unusual in that regard, and that even at the professional retreat that I went to, most of the authors that go do not come close to finishing their book. So I was kind of driven to do it. I was motivated to do it, and I decided, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it well, and it worked out wonderfully for me. So, and I had the time to do it too. So that was another thing. So bottom line, two things. I talked about the one-on-one coaching program, and I talked about the next retreat coming up, which is going to be March 19th and 20th. And I would expect that the next retreat after that will probably be in May. And I'll also tell you that I already have 2 authors who are signed up and paid for the next retreat. So that's a happening thing. One is a brand new author that was coming to this last retreat, but had to leave because of a family emergency. And another one who was a returning author from a previous retreat a while ago. He decided to rejoin the gang, and he had to leave because he had an adoption that popped up this weekend. He had to be present for that. So all very understandable. So, but they have paid. I offered to give them a refund. They said, absolutely not. What I want to do, each of them said, what I want to do is go to the next retreat, keep the money, and I'll just go to the next retreat. So all good. So yay, I'm excited. I'm excited that they're excited about going, and that they're committed too. So a couple other things I want to talk about, and this is just something to keep in mind in terms of as you're doing your writing. So what you're going to do now is you're going to go through, if you've handwritten your manuscript, if you've handwritten your book, what you're going to do is, of course, transcribe it to a laptop, or some sort of a Word document, or a document of some type. So it's typed up. As you're doing that, what you'll find is that you want to do some revision. Everyone goes through this. I certainly went through this, because when I was doing my inspired writing, what I would typically do is I was writing as fast as I can, just like I was instructed. And as I got to certain points where I wanted to express certain emotions or certain aspects, I used a lot of the same phraseology to express what I was feeling in a way that captured my emotions and my intent. But as I was doing my transcribing from my handwritten notes about this to a laptop, I realized that I didn't want to use the same phrase over and over again. Of course I didn't. I wanted to make it more interesting, and oftentimes I wanted to use something more specific to the situation, as opposed to being excited, using the word excited all the time. There are other ways to express the fact that I was excited. I could be surprised, I could be amazed, I could be any number of things that more accurately describe what I was feeling at that moment. So as you're transcribing from handwritten notes to your Word document, where you're going to incorporate your book, or where you're going to make that your draft book, you're going to be doing some revising. And as you're revising, there's something, and let me take a step back. For those who did it all on a laptop, you're going to want to start going through it and make sure, because I told you directly, don't edit, don't organize, don't do any of that stuff. Don't spell check, none of that stuff as you're going through your inspired writing. Just keep moving forward. So now's a chance, once you're done, to go back and check what you've written. Make sure it says what you think it's supposed to say. Make sure that the spelling's correct. And same thing as if you hand wrote. If you're using the same phrases or the same words time and time again, then you change that up. So now's the time to do that revision. Now's the time to do that editing, self-editing that I've talked about previously. And as you're doing it, I want to encourage you to put your headset on and listen to the music that you listened to as you created your manuscript, because that will help you uh, capture that same feeling and drop into your heart, so that you're writing from a heartfelt perspective. In this case, you would be editing or revising from a heartfelt perspective. It really helps. And you've trained yourself to do that. You've been at the retreat, you know how it works, you've trained yourself to do it. I heartily encourage you to do that as you're going through your revising and editing process. There's some things that I want you to keep in mind as you're going through the revising and editing process. And one is, I want you to differentiate between emphasis and emotion. Oftentimes, people, as they write, because they're aware of what they're thinking about and they're aware of the emotions they were feeling, as they write, they will simply use exclamation points or question marks to express the emotion that they're feeling at the time. And that's not, exclamation points are shouting. They are not expressing emotion, they're expressing emphasis. You're emphasizing something that's going on, but you're not really telling us what emotion is involved in that. For example, an exclamation point can mean anger, it can mean surprise, it can mean exasperation, it can mean any number of emotions that you're trying to express forcefully, but it doesn't tell us what it means, what the emotion is. When you're doing this, when you're writing and you want to express emotion, spell out the emotion that you want. And it's important to spell out the emotion that you're feeling as you're writing your story, or that the characters in your story are feeling, because that's what keeps readers interested. It's not just the narrative of every story, which is important. You need to do that in an organized, engaging manner. It's the emotion that you express as you're telling your story. That's part of being a good storyteller. And part of expressing the emotion is actually stating the emotion. Don't assume that a reader is going to understand your emotion because you understand what emotion you felt. They're not you. They don't have your experience. They aren't visualizing that experience that you are visualizing in its fullest. So make sure you express your emotion by stating your emotion and not just emphasis. And in fact, let me take this a step further. As a general rule, I don't use exclamation points, with one exception. I use, if you're describing dialogue, and dialogue is a fantastic way to tell your story by recreating dialogue between different characters. And if what you're saying, if the story you're telling is a memoir, if it's your story, then typically the dialogue is between you and someone else. Dialogue is fantastic. Anytime you can use dialogue, I strongly recommend it, because it typically indicates an important point in your story, an important point in your chapter. And there's a way to display dialogue that really highlights what's being said, and it will grab a reader's attention, and it will make your point very, very clear. And it's a great way to tell your story, is through recreating dialogue between two characters, between you and someone else. If during that dialogue someone is yelling or someone is emphasizing to where an exclamation point is appropriate, then by all means use an exclamation point. That's a good, that you're incorporating that as part of the dialogue, and that's a good way to make things authentic and to describe the emotions that to help describe the emotions that the characters themselves are feeling, characters in that dialogue. It's also important, I mean, taking this a step further, instead of saying I said, he said, I said, he said, as you go through each of the different parts of the dialogue, you can say it I yelled, he retorted, I implied, as you say a line of dialogue, you can say it in a way that's not just said or told me or something like that. Use more descriptive language to talk about how things were said or what was emphasized. And then if you need to use exclamation points or question marks or things like that, then do that. And of course, as you're doing the dialogue, the prepositions, or not prepositions, the pronouns, I or he or you or whatever, I or you in particular, those are important. You would use that in a dialogue appropriately as part of your discussion. For other parts of your book, if you're doing a memoir, as best you can, use I when you're talking about yourself, or use, if you're talking about kind of third person looking at the scene, use he or she or them or they, things like that. Stay away from you, meaning as you're trying to describe something and you're trying to describe something, like a common way of saying this is saying like, when you go to the store, you pick up vegetables. I mean, I'm just making up that sentence. Well, the fact of the matter is, you're not telling the reader to go to the store and pick up vegetables. A better way to say that, and the intent of saying it the way I described, is to describe what typically happens or what normally happens. And you say, when you do this, then this happens. Stay away from that. You're not telling the reader to do something. And a better way to put that is saying something along the lines of, typically when a customer goes to the store, they do this. Or typically when I go to the store, I do this. Or you could even say, typically when we go to the store, we do this. So I, we, them, they, she, he, those are good pronouns to use in your writing, as opposed to you. Stay away from you. Stay away from exclamation points. A better way, if you're trying to emphasize something, and this gets back to what I just said, if you're trying to emphasize something in your writing, use your descriptive words, use your emotions, use adjectives that adequately express what you're trying to express. Don't use exclamation points. And I'm not saying this 100% all the time. I mean, sometimes you certainly can, and it's appropriate, and it's a writing style. So this rule is not hard and fast, never ever deviate. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that as best you can, stay away from using exclamation points in your non-dialogue writing. In a dialogue, that's different, but in your non-dialogue writing, stay away from exclamation points. All right, so I've beaten that down into the ground. Another thing I wanted to describe is naming characters or describing characters. And for all of our stories, of course, we're going to have an array of characters in our stories. And some of them, of course, are going to be more significant than others. Some of them are going to be very prominent. Some of them are almost as important as you in the story. And I'll give you an example. I'll use my book as an example. In my book, of course, I'm the central character. In any memoir, regardless of the different themes associated with a memoir that you would be writing, you are the most important character. You're the primary character. Keep that in mind. Other characters are also important. Spouses, children, parents, best friends, other people that are really significant in your life who have more than just a passing significance in your life. They are very important. So those are the primary characters. And I would say that those people should always be named and always be named by their correct names. And again, I'll use my book as an example. In my book, um, as I wrote my memoir, I included some very painful experiences, and I've talked with you guys about this before, of course. My mother was an alcoholic. She's a beautiful, wonderful woman, but she also was an alcoholic, and it was very painful growing up with her. I also had a wife before I had Anya as my wife, and I got a divorce from her, and that was a very painful divorce in my late 20s. Both of them, anyone who's close to me, anyone who knows me, knows of them. They know their real names. If I tried to give them a different name or tried to just refer to them as my ex-wife or my mother without naming them, then that would seem disrespectful. It would seem disingenuous. And especially if I gave them a different name than what their real name is, it could be very confusing to people who know me, who would be wondering, wait a second, did you have another wife that we don't know about, that other than the one that you did have, that you got divorced from? So anyone who's really significant in your life, especially if they're related to you in some way, shape, or form, then use their real name. Hard and fast rule. I will say this, though, that my ex-wife, because well, let me just take a step back. My ex-wife and I got divorced, of course. She remarried, as did I. And I made the specific decision, and I believe it's completely the right one. It wasn't a hard decision either, to never use her last name, even her maiden name, but certainly not her post-marriage to me name, so that all I refer to her is, the only way I refer to her is as Carol. And that was her real name, Carol. And so I talk about Carol. She's in several chapters in that section of the book where I talk about my divorce and what have you, and what I learned from that experience. Carol, that's her name. Everyone knows that I was married to Carol. They don't know her maiden name. They don't know her post marriage to me name, and that's fine. That's fine. But that's a good, honest way of describing it. My mother, of course, my father's name was Walter Hurd, and my mother's name was Ann Hurd. Everyone knows that. I do introduce my mother as Ann, but for the most part, I refer to her as Mom or my mother, something like that. So, but if I called her something different, it would be ridiculous. So people like that, very important, refer to them by their real names. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are just bit players, who have a role at some point in your book, and you just kind of want to refer to what happened when they were in that role. And I'll use an example. For example, if you have if you had an incident in a store that you wanted to talk about. I'm just saying this as a hypothetical example. And one of the characters in that store was a shop clerk that you interfaced with. It might have been a really positive experience, might have been a really negative experience. I suggest, especially if it's a negative experience or neutral, I suggest that you just use the title of the job that they have. Unless if it was positive and you remember their name, go ahead and do that. Use their name. And I'll talk about using names here in a second. But if it was a negative experience, then just use their job title. Saying I went up to the cashier, and the cashier was extraordinarily rude, and you can describe the interaction because it's important to your story or what have you. And just use their job title. And in that way, you're not really naming them. It's not anything that will be embarrassing to them later down the line. If for some reason that person ever picks up your book and sees this interaction, they'll know that no one will ever know it was them. And there's no reason to gratuitously hurt someone in your book, even though they may have hurt you along the way. So, or yeah, that's just a good rule in general. But for those people who are just appear briefly in your book and then move on to something else, then if it's a neutral or a negative experience, you don't need any of them. Just give their job position, and you can include them as part of the story. And there's a middle character. There's a middle ground. There's really significant characters, and then there's those who fade in and out of your story. There's a huge middle ground of characters who are significant, but they aren't primary or next to primary in their prominence. And for those characters, if you're speaking of them positively, then I suggest you give their name. If they're a significant character of some type, then give their first and last name. People love to see their name in print. And if you're giving someone kudos, or if you're complimenting them, or if you're talking about what a great job they did, or how much they meant to you, or what a good friend they are, use their name, even if they aren't in your story for that long. You're doing a lot of good by doing that, because you're expressing to them how much you cared for them and how important they were and how much you loved them at the time. That's great. That's part of what you want to be doing as a writer. You want to be expressing your appreciation and the meaningful. You want to identify the meaningful people and meaningful events in your life. So if it's a positive interaction, or if it's a positive character, then I would encourage you to use their name, even their full name. If it's a positive interaction and the character doesn't really appear much, you can just use their first name. But using their name's good. Don't get wrapped up about getting rights or permissions or things like that. No one cares. I mean, it's important to get rights at the appropriate time, or permissions at the appropriate time. For example, if you're describing something that may, in fact, in hindsight, or here you are 20 or 30 or 40 years later, and you're describing something that might embarrass somebody, even though it was a positive experience for you, then you don't need to use their name. Be aware of the impact that your description might be having on that person's life at this point in their life, years or decades later. But as a general rule, if you're speaking well of someone or speaking positively of someone, then use their name. And people will love it. I've gotten comments from people about how much they appreciate being remembered in my book, and that can certainly be your experience as well. So what I've just described are pretty good general rules for naming characters and identifying characters. And one of the things I described previously in previous sessions during our prep sessions was the importance of describing characters, or setting the scene. And part of that setting the scene is describing your character. So if it's a really important person, spouse, parent, sibling, children, go ahead when you introduce them, or at the appropriate point. Sometimes you introduce them because the story, an early story or an initial story, requires them to be introduced, and you can introduce them, and you can just have one or two lines of who they are and why they're important to the story. And then the next time you talk about them, you can go into a lot more detail. So you don't need to go into great detail early on if it takes away from the impact of the narrative. If you have a fast moving story that you're starting your book out with, and that happens with a lot of people, and you're introducing a character that's important to the story but isn't necessarily critical to this first reader grabbing story that you're describing, then you can just introduce them briefly, and then later, the next time you talk about them, you can talk in more detail about who they are and what they're like, and what they like and what they mean to you. And so you can go into a lot more detail, so we as the readers can get more focus in terms of, and embrace them more, because we want to know about you. Your readers want to know about you as the primary character, but also we want to know about who's important to you and other important characters in the story. And so there's a spectrum to that as well. If it's a really important character, go into a deeper description as to who they are when you're introducing them, and as you describe them throughout your book. If it's someone who was a positive, had a positive impact on your life, and you want to name them because of that, which is great. You don't necessarily need to go in as deep of a description about who they are and what they look like and what they're feeling and your impression of them, all that stuff. If they're only someone who pops in, has an important role, and then pops out. So it's a little bit of a spectrum in terms of how deep you want to go in the description based on how significant they are to your story. All right, so there's description and there's naming, and now let's talk about the really difficult sliver of those people who you may not view positively even years after you've known them. And we all have them. And naming them and describing them can be a bit tricky, in the sense that we want to be sensitive. We want to look at these painful events that happened in our life that we're now talking about, that we're now being very genuine with our emotions as we describe these events. But we don't want to hurt people years after the event. That's almost never a good idea. So how do we do that? And I'm going to give you two examples from my book. One is I had a sixth grade teacher, and I have a whole chapter on this guy in my book. He humiliated me. He just ranted at me and was very insulting. And I'm an 11-year-old boy. He felt I had crossed the line into what he felt was an acceptable way of describing what I intended to do in a speech. He thought that I was like way overboard, and he just lit into me. And it was a terrible experience. Obviously, it was terrible. It stayed with me for decades, and this was something that I didn't talk about it with anybody. Not that it was anything that I consciously hid, but it's just something that's there. These wounds can stay with us after a while. And I learned from that experience, because I learned the importance of treating people with respect, and to be aware of my words and how they might affect them, especially if I'm talking in front of other people. And so part of the intent of my book was to describe these type of events in my life, being very honest with emotions, and talking about what I learned from these experiences. And it worked. It's worked. I feel great about having expressed that. But the question is, what I'm talking about here is, how do we identify these people? And he's the only one in my book that I gave a different name to. Because if I didn't name him, it wouldn't seem as genuine. If I talk about this teacher that had this horrible impact in my life, and I didn't name the teacher, it's kind of almost feels like I'm telling a disingenuous story, or I'm making something up, and that clearly wasn't the case. so I didn't want to do that, and certainly wanted to be very genuine about it. And it doesn't have as much impact if I don't give the person a name, because throughout the chapter I'm describing this person, and I would need to name him every once in a while. So what I chose to do, again, for the only time in my book, was I referred to him, I gave him a different name. I called him Mr. Smith. And then when I first identified him as Mr. Smith, I put in parentheses after that name, I put not his real name. So as I'm introducing Mr. Smith, put parentheses right after that saying not his real name. And then I told the story. And whenever I'd refer to him in my story, I'd say Mr. Smith or he or whatever I was going to say. So that's one way of navigating this, where you want to talk about a painful event in your life from a significant character, but you don't want to hurt that character. For all I know, Mr. Smith is still around, and Mr. Smith could conceivably read this book, and I would not want to name him, because as I look back on that event and I look back on things that were going on in society at that time, there could be some mitigating circumstances as to why he decided to launch on me. I mean, it was kind of inexcusable that a teacher would launch on an 11-year-old like that, but as I look back on it, I can understand it more, and I did express that as part of the book. And I certainly would not want him to feel identified as having caused this in my life at this point in my life. He's probably, honestly, he's got to be in his 80s if he's still around. I don't know, you know. So using an alias is a way to do this. Another way to do this is to just refer to someone as, in the military, you can refer to them as by their rank or their previous position. So I had a couple of people who I needed to go through this whole naming protocol. One was a really terrible instructor pilot I had at the very beginning of pilot training, and he was so bad that I was the only student they ever let him teach, because I went up for my first check ride, and this is the check ride that if people are going to fail out of pilot training, this is the one that they fail. Is this very first check ride. This is the one where the evaluated pilots are looking at everything really critically. And I went into that check ride not knowing procedures that I should have known, and there were other ones that he had taught me taught me incorrectly, and so I got more wrong on that check ride than I did correct. It was a disaster, and so I had a recheck scheduled, and based on my original check ride, I'm sure people thought that there's no way that Lieutenant Hurd is going to be able to pass his check ride because he did so horribly the first time around. So that was an important part of the story that I wanted to tell, and because pilot training itself was traumatic enough that, in fact, it was a significant impact on my life, as it is. I think every Air Force pilot will tell you something similar. And for some people, it was more traumatic than others, but it was traumatic, maybe not the right word. It was challenging, really challenging. And it turned out to be one of the things I am most proud of in my life, because I got off to a bad start, but I recovered, and through determination and confidence, I passed and did well, and my Air Force career was off and running. But I did want to include this gentleman in the story, so I chose not to use his full name, because again, I wouldn't want him to be identified as this person who really failed at doing their job. Yet at the same time, it was an important part of the story. So what I did was I just referred to him as the Major. And in this part of the story, referring to him as the Major, it was clear who I was talking about. I identified him as the Major who taught me as my instructor. And then as I went through I would keep going. And when I would need to rename him, I would just call him the Major. So that's one way to do it. Another one, this is the last example I'll give, is I took over command of an air refueling group. There are almost 600 people in the group. And I took over from a gentleman who was the one guy in the Air Force I didn't get along with. And I can honestly say that. I mean, there are people who I didn't necessarily care for that much, but this was the one guy who I just didn't get along with. And, I realized everything's a co-creation. So for whatever reason, we didn't get along with each other. And he had integrity problems, and he was a bully, and that obviously didn't sit well with me. So when I took over his group, one of the first things that happened was I found out that he had been telling the entire group at public events and privately that they're going to hate me as a commander because, whatever reasons he made up. It was really bad. And I chose not to respond to that. And it later came up, it wasn't too long before I got some hate mail from people in the squad. And so I had to deal with that. So as I'm telling these stories, and there were some other things that went along with that in terms of a lack of integrity and different other traps that he had set that basically I had to navigate my way out of. So as I'm describing him, I did not want to use his name. Again, even under these circumstances, there was really no reason to publicly embarrass him. So I just referred to him as my predecessor. My predecessor did this, my predecessor did that. And yes, of course, I do understand, especially something like that, where if people did some research, they could find out who my predecessor was and they would know who he was. But I did not need to be naming that person as part of my book. So there's ways to do it. So if you have someone in your story, as you're doing your revision and your editing and you're creating new material and you're talking about a painful event, or you're describing someone who kind of negatively, you can deal with it in three ways. One is you give them an alias. That's one way to do it. I just talked about that. Another one is you talk about them in terms of their title. If they have a title like a military rank, or a doctor, if you want to say the doctor did this or what have you. That's one way of doing it. And then the third way is to talk about the position they held as this was going on. My predecessor, for example, my instructor pilot. Those are ways you can identify them. You can talk freely about what you want, but you're still being respectful, and you're not laying some sort of an embarrassing trap for them down the line, because these people may very well still be around. Some of that, they probably are still around. If they come across this, you don't want to be embarrassing them. Who knows what they're doing now, and they may have felt guilt over it. And if it shows up in print, that would be even worse. Which takes me to my next point, and that's the importance of empathy. Empathy is critical to make our books relatable and meaningful. So as we describe people in our lives and events in our lives, but especially people, because we're talking about empathy. And this is particularly true of people who we may have had negative experiences with. If we're talking about someone who has caused us pain, or who has let us down, or any of those negative, disappointing experiences, first of all, we need to be true to our emotions. We don't want to sugarcoat something when we know that it was a lot more painful than what we may be describing. We don't want to excuse people. We don't want to sugarcoat things. So be honest with your emotions. There's a way to express negative emotions that is true to what we feel, but it's also respectful. We can do it in terms of how it affected us, as opposed to attributing negative motivations to the other person. So if you, when you find, well, not even an if, when you find yourself in a situation where you're describing someone in your life who has let you down, or who has hurt you, or who has disappointed you, talk about how they let you down, how they disappointed you, how they hurt you. So what did you feel? And describe it from your perspective. I felt this. I felt that. Uh, as much as you can, stay away from attributing uh, motivations to them. I mean, that's almost a fine line, in the sense that for someone who's being mean to you, it may be apparent that they were being selfish or disloyal. And you can even say those type of things by saying, it appeared to me they were being very selfish. It appeared to me that he was really disloyal when I was counting on him. It's okay to say that. And there's a difference between saying that and saying he was selfish, he was disloyal. Do you see the difference there? In one case, you're talking about your perception of what their motivation was. And in another case, you're attributing a motivation to them. So again, that might seem like a fine line, but there's a big difference. When you're talking about things like that, make sure that you talk about your perception of what happened, as opposed to characterizing their motivations. And characterizing also can mean, if you characterize a person's behavior in terms of like, for example, you could talk about someone being mean. You feel that they were mean, you feel that they were disrespectful. And you can also, you would be tempted to say something like, he was a complete jerk. He was or worse. Don't characterize them as a jerk, because what we can find is that our interpretation of what that characterization means can be different than what other people understand that to be. So a jerk, to me, when I call someone a jerk, not that I do that often, but when I call someone a jerk, I have an idea in my mind what being a jerk entails. You are going to have a different interpretation of that same word. So if I characterize someone, I could see them as a certain way, and I know what I mean to say. You could come up with a completely different interpretation, and that's easier done than you might think. So the way to get around that is to describe what your feelings were, or what your interpretation of what was going on was, or what this meant to you. Talk about it, talk about their behavior from your perspective. And you can come to conclusions, but you identify it as your conclusion as opposed to labeling them. That's all very important. And this all comes back to empathy, because when we characterize someone, we're not showing empathy. We're not showing an understanding of, or an attempt to understand who they are or what their motivations might be. And it's not being, we're not being retrospective about what went on. We're not taking a step back and trying to understand what all transpired and why it transpired the way it did. We're just labeling someone. That can be very hurtful. You don't want to do that. Typically, you don't want to do that. I should say almost in all cases. So as I mentioned, what you really want to do is describe these things like describing your emotions from your perspective. Don't attribute characterizations or attribute emotions to other people or label them. Talk about what happened, and you can use all of these terms or descriptions typically, but do it from your perspective, saying, this is what I felt, this is what I saw, this is what it seemed to be like to me. Much better, less hurtful, and it's clearer that way because we're not labeling someone and relying on the reader to come up with an interpretation as to what that label means. So, and it's being clearer as a writer. All right, the last thing I want to talk about in this regard is self-awareness versus self-sabotage. We want to be self-aware. We want to understand our emotions and express that and talk about it from the perspective of, I see now that I did this because of reasons A, B, and C. That's important. That shows to the reader that you're a mature human being, that you have the ability to take a step back and take a look at what went on and to detach yourself from what probably was a very emotional situation. And in hindsight and with maturity, you see it as being this way instead of what all transpired right at the beginning. And it's okay. Actually, let me emphasize, it's okay to describe something that happened to you using the emotions you felt at that moment. That's perfectly okay. I would follow that up with a more retrospective look at, as time goes by, I realized that this, and this were going on also that may have affected my perspective on what happened. So, and that again is also the sign of a good writer, in the sense that you're taking a look at things beyond the immediate moment of when it happened, good, bad, or ugly. And you're looking at it from a more mature, detached perspective. And that's good to incorporate that. And then there's another step beyond that, which I would highly encourage you to take. And that is, after you talk about something, after you talk about the emotions you felt at the moment, and then you take a more detached look at it, that's great. Those are two great steps. Those are two very important steps. And the third step is talking about what you learned from that experience, because we're learning all the time, even from painful experiences in our lives. What did we learn about ourselves, about others from these experiences? And talk about that as well. And that really makes a very positive impact, because you are showing your growth and your understanding of the situation, because it is you have taken a very, very negative situation, and you have understood it to be something different than your initial reaction, and you've grown from that experience. So I would encourage you to do that as well. So let me see if there's anything else. Okay. With that, I think I am about done. And just to recap real quickly, most importantly, you guys were fantastic. I loved having you at the retreat. You're all wonderful. I am saying this very genuinely with my heart. I don't emphasize this as much with my previous retreats. I loved all of them as well, but this one was quite special, and I want you to understand that all of you, every one of you, very special. And it was a privilege to have you at my retreat, and I'm excited about it. I'm excited about your writing journey. One-on-one coaching, would love to talk with you about that. For those 3 who are new to the retreat, we'll have a chance to do that as part of our one-on-one coaching session that comes with a retreat. We can talk more about that. For the others, if you have any questions about it, I probably explained it to you more than once, but I encourage you, if you aren't actively in the one-on-one program now, I encourage you to jump right in. The water's fine. Jump right in, and we'll pick up where you left off, and you'll love it. And you'll love it because you've all been there before. For Amber, Meg, and and Kelly, for Amber, Meg, and Kelly. I'll be sending you a note or an email telling you how to sign up for one-on-one, and we'll talk further about that later. For all of you, March 19th and 20th is our next retreat. I would love to have you there with us, and you can continue your writing. You can continue on your path, and you can meet some wonderful new people, and you can reconnect with those of us who are here at the retreat, and would love to have you there. And as I mentioned, for returning writers, returning retreat writers, it's half price. It's only $98. So, and what you're giving yourself is you're committing to another weekend of writing to continue your author journey, and to meet and connect with some wonderful new people, and to get back into it. And you'll love it. You'll love it. People jump right in. As I mentioned, the one gentleman who's going to be at our next retreat, I think the last time I talked with him, I coached him as an author, was over a year ago, and he's jumping back in, and I'm excited to see him, and I can tell he's excited to get back into it. So it'll be great. You guys are wonderful. I'm going to sign off now. I'm going to sign off from my monologue. If you have any questions about any of this, please let me know, and I would be happy to write you back, or we can have a phone call or text me, anything, to continue on this path. I'm excited to be talking with each and every one of you further, and you guys are awesome. Keep it up. It was a lot of fun. Have a wonderful remaining weekend, and we'll talk to you again soon.